They promised us the sky would turn silver with the glory of 1,000,000 returning ships, heavy with the spoils of a conquered world. Instead, the sky just burned. The orbital alarms above Valar Prime had not sounded in a millennium. Yet they shrieked to life as a single, solitary vessel tore through the upper atmosphere. It was the dreadnought Sun Eater, the flagship of the Grand Armada. But it looked nothing like the gleaming apex of Vailari engineering that had departed months ago. Its impenetrable dark matter hull was scarred, melted, and weeping trails of radioactive coolant into the clouds. The vessel did not assume a victorious geostationary orbit. It fell like a wounded beast, barely managing to engage its emergency thrusters before crashing into the obsidian dunes outside the capital city. Out of 1,000,000 warships sent to subjugate a primitive blue speck on the outer rim, one had returned. The shockwave of its impact was nothing compared to the political earthquake that immediately struck the high echelons of the Empire. Deep beneath the capital, in a sterile interrogation chamber lined with sensory-dampening fields, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and fear. High Lord Kalen paced the floor, his ceremonial robes of spun gold catching the harsh overhead light. Kalen was a creature of the ascendant caste, a man whose ambition was matched only by his profound arrogance. He stopped and slammed his fists onto the interrogator's table. Sitting opposite him was Fleet Commander Vane. Only days ago, Vane had been the Empire's most decorated hero, the absolute authority over the largest invasion force ever assembled. Now, he was a hollow shell. His ornate armor was stripped away, replaced by a drab prisoner's tunic. His skin was pale, his posture slumped, and his left eye was covered by a crude synthetic patch that Kalen found deeply offensive to look at. Kalen leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. He demanded to know where the fleet was. He demanded to know why the resource guilds were threatening to rebel because the promised endless bounties of Earth had not arrived. He demanded to know how the undisputed master of Vailari military might have lost 1,000,000 ships to a species that had barely mastered basic atom splitting. Vane slowly raised his head. His remaining eye held no fear, no respect for Kalen's political rank, only a haunting, bottomless exhaustion. When he finally spoke, his voice was coarse, like grinding stones. He told Kalen that the guilds could choke on their ledgers. He told him the Empire was already dead. They just had not realized it yet. Kalen threatened him with execution. He threatened to erase Vane's bloodline from the historical registry. But threats hold no water against a man who has already watched the universe tear itself apart. Vane ignored the posturing and began to speak of the departure, forcing Kalen to listen to the prologue of their doom. Vane recounted the launch, an event of such staggering scale that it defied comprehension. 1,000,000 dreadnoughts, cruisers, and planetary siege platforms rising from the shipyards. They had literally eclipsed the twin suns of Valar. The ruling council had decreed this expansion not out of necessity, but out of simple, naked greed. The Sol system was a minor coordinate on their star charts, noted only for a high concentration of liquid water and abundant biological diversity. The indigenous species, humanity, was classified as highly aggressive but technologically infantile. Taking their world was supposed to be a logistical exercise, a minor stepping stone in the Empire's eternal mandate to rule the cosmos. Even then, amidst the roaring engines and the cheering billions, Vane had felt a quiet unease. It was an unease shared by only one other person in the entire armada, Sub-Commander Lyra. Merely speaking her name in the cold interrogation room brought a flicker of profound pain to Vane's face. Lyra belonged to the erudite caste, the scholars and intelligence gatherers who were historically viewed with deep suspicion by the warrior elite. Her assignment to Vane's command ship was a forced political compromise, an attempt by the Council to ensure the scientists had a front-row seat to document the harvesting of Earth. What the Council did not know, and what would have meant immediate execution for treason, was that Vane and Lyra had been secret lovers for years. Vane described their stolen moments in the dim light of the Dreadnought's observation deck, watching the stars blur into streaks of light as they folded space. Lyra was sharp, cynical, and entirely unimpressed by military bravado, while the generals drank fermented wine and planned how to divide the conquered continents. Lyra spent her time analyzing the deep space telemetry from the Sol system. She had warned him. She told him the data was wrong. A species as supposedly chaotic and primitive as humanity should leak a massive amount of radio frequency waste into the void. Their orbital space should be cluttered with poorly constructed satellites and debris. But the readings Lyra pulled from the long-range scanners showed a system that was far too clean. The High Lords back home had dismissed her reports. They claimed the humans had simply killed themselves off in a localized nuclear conflict, leaving a pristine, empty world ready for the taking. Kalen, standing in the interrogation room, interrupted to confirm this was the official intelligence assessment. He sneered, stating that the erudite caste always saw shadows where there was only light. Vane smiled. It was a terrifying, broken smile. He told Kalen that they should have listened to the shadows. He closed his eye and vividly painted the picture of the Armada's arrival. Folding space on a mass scale was a violent process. 1,000,000 ships tore back into real space at the edge of the Oort cloud, the icy shell surrounding the human solar system. The energy discharge alone should have triggered every rudimentary early warning system on Earth. The Vailari gunners primed their plasma batteries. Shields were raised to maximum capacity, and millions of soldiers stood ready in their drop pods, adrenaline surging through their veins. They anticipated panicked human defense fleets scrambling to intercept. They anticipated archaic nuclear missiles screaming toward them from the dark. Instead, they found nothing. The Vailari Armada pushed past the orbit of Neptune, then Jupiter, then Mars. The mighty war machine of a galactic empire sailed through the void with its fangs bared, meeting absolutely zero resistance. Vane described the chilling, suffocating silence that settled over the command deck. The sensory officers reported no defensive grids, no orbital military stations, no panicked broadcasts echoing between the planets. Just the cold, dead vacuum of space. It was as if the human race had simply vanished, leaving their jewel of a world entirely unprotected. Kalen crossed his arms, asserting that this proved the humans were cowards who had hidden deep underground at the first sign of superior beings. Vane leaned forward, the chains binding his wrists clinking against the metal table. He looked up at the High Lord, the sole survivor of 1,000,000 ship slaughter, and whispered a truth that would haunt the Empire for the rest of its short existence. They were not hiding. They were waiting. A predator's greatest vulnerability is the belief that its prey is already dead. We sailed into the human solar system with our chests puffed out, blind to the jaws slowly closing around us. Vane leaned back in the interrogation chair, his lone eye fixing Kalen with a gaze colder than the void. The Vailari Armada had pushed past the gas giants, their immense gravity wells serving as mere mile markers on the road to conquest. They expected automated defense grids near the asteroid belt. They found only ghosts. The massive mining colonies built into the larger asteroids were completely stripped bare. There was no machinery left, no refined ore, and absolutely no bodies, just hollowed-out metal husks drifting aimlessly. The tension on the command deck of the Sun Eater was thick enough to choke on. The Vailari shock troops, pumped full of combat stimulants and ready to breach human hulls, were left pacing their deployment bays like caged animals. The silence of the Sol system was not the silence of the defeated. It was the silence of a held breath. The first break in the quiet came not from a missile lock, but from the communications array. Lyra, working frantically at her console, managed to isolate a fragmented broadcast bouncing off the ruined lunar colonies. Vane ordered it projected onto the main viewing screen, expecting a final declaration of war or a desperate plea for terms of surrender. Instead, the bridge crew was subjected to a barrage of human historical archives that defied all tactical logic. They watched in horrified fascination as a brightly painted manic figure with unnaturally red hair aggressively peddled processed meat cylinders to a crowd of screaming human children. Vane's chief cultural analyst, trembling slightly, suggested it was a terrifying religious mantra, a cult of chaotic blood worshippers offering their young to a meat demon. Another intercepted transmission featured a wildly gesturing human male loudly screaming about insane, rock-bottom prices while violently smashing ground transports with a large hammer. The Vailari officers concluded that humanity worshipped a wrathful, destructive deity known as the Market, and that their society was built on a foundation of aggressive, ritualistic madness. It was darkly humorous, a brief moment of absurdity that caused the hardened generals to scoff at the primitive nature of their enemy. They were laughing right up until the fabric of space itself tried to crush them. The laughter died instantly as the vanguard of the fleet crossed the threshold between Mars and Earth. There was no warning klaxon, no incoming fire. A massive Vailari supply cruiser simply lurched violently out of formation. Its hull groaned under an impossible strain before snapping cleanly in half, spilling its molten core and thousands of crew members into the dark. Seconds later, a frigate was violently yanked sideways, slamming into the flank of a dreadnought in a bloom of silent, expanding plasma. Vane gripped his command console, shouting for tactical readouts. The space ahead was not empty. The humans had not built physical minefields. They had somehow engineered localized gravity wells, invisible, highly concentrated sinkholes in the vacuum. These traps were undetectable by standard mass sensors until a ship was already caught in the crushing pull. The mighty formation of the Grand Armada, designed to overwhelm with sheer unified numbers, became a deadly liability. Ships scrambled to evade the invisible hazards, crashing into one another in their panic. Vane immediately ordered the fleet to halt their advance and deploy deep space probes to map the gravitational anomalies. It was the only sound tactical decision, but sound tactics hold no sway over political ambition. The heavy blast doors of the command bridge slid open, and High Commissar Theron marched in, flanked by his personal guard. Theron was an elite political overseer from the ruling council, a man who had never seen combat but wore enough medals to armor a small transport. He pointed a trembling finger at Vane, accusing the fleet commander of cowardice in the face of a phantom enemy. Theron demanded that the fleet maintain its maximum thrust. The homeworld required a swift, decisive victory to pacify the restless resource guilds, and he would not let a few navigational hazards delay the Empire's glory. Vane argued, citing the escalating casualty reports scrolling across his screens. He warned Theron that they were marching blindly into a meticulously designed kill zone, but the Commissar invoked the absolute authority of the High Lords. Disobeying a direct order to advance was treason, punishable by the immediate execution of Vane and his entire bridge crew. Gritting his teeth, Vane rescinded the halt order. He commanded the fleet to push forward, brute-forcing their way through the invisible minefield. It was a slaughter. By the time the Armada cleared the orbital path of Earth's moon, nearly 50,000 ships had been torn apart by the gravity traps or destroyed in secondary collisions. The politicians cheered the arrival at Earth orbit, entirely dismissing the horrific cost of the journey. Finally, the blue jewel of the Sol system hung directly below them. The Armada assumed an aggressive bombardment formation, blocking out the sun and casting a massive, terrifying shadow over the northern hemisphere. On the dark side of the planet, massive, sprawling megacities glowed with intense clustered light. The human population centers were densely packed, ripe for destruction. Commissar Theron, practically salivating at the prospect of absolute destruction, ordered the preliminary bombardment. The strategy was brutal and simple. Glass the major capitals, break the human spirit, and then send down the harvesting ships to strip the ashes. 1,000,000 ships charged their primary plasma capacitors. The collective energy buildup caused the localized magnetic fields to scream. On Vane's mark, the sky above Earth ignited. 1,000,000 beams of superheated plasma rained down upon the glowing human metropolises. The visual feed on the command deck flared an absolute blinding white as the apocalyptic strikes connected. But as the glare faded, there was no massive dust cloud. There were no secondary explosions. There were no thermal spikes indicating the vaporization of concrete and steel. The plasma beams had simply struck empty dirt, barren rock, and open ocean. Down on the surface, the sprawling, luminous megacities flickered. The towering skyscrapers, the busy transit lines, the pulsing lights of human civilization began to glitch and distort. Slowly, seamlessly, the cities faded away into thin air. They were nothing but monumental, incredibly high-fidelity holographic projections. The humans had lured the greatest military force in the galaxy into a precise firing alignment and tricked them into emptying their primary weapon capacitors into the dirt. A chilling realization washed over the command deck, freezing the blood of every Vailari officer. If the glowing cities below were just a mirage designed to waste their heavy ordnance, then the true, fortified human settlements were still out there, completely untouched, and the Vailari Armada, with its primary weapons currently in a forced cooling cycle, was now sitting completely defenseless in low orbit. A paralyzed titan in the sky is nothing but a very large target. When the humans finally fired back, they did not use light or energy. They used raw, unadulterated iron. In the interrogation room, High Lord Kalen scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. He accused Vane of exaggerating to cover his own tactical incompetence. Kalen argued that no primitive ballistic weapon could possibly penetrate a Vailari deflector shield, a technology capable of withstanding the coronal mass ejection of a dying star. Vane looked up, his single eye burning with a mixture of grief and dark amusement. He explained to the High Lord that this was precisely the problem. The Vailari had spent thousands of years perfecting defenses against high-energy thermal weapons, plasma bursts, and quantum destabilizing beams. The humans had looked at those glowing, impenetrable shields and simply decided to bypass the physics of energy warfare entirely. Back in the skies above Earth, the command deck of the Sun Eater was a madhouse. The primary plasma capacitors were locked in a mandatory 30-minute cooling cycle. 1,000,000 warships sat motionless in low orbit, completely defenseless. Commissar Theron, sweating profusely under his heavy political medals. Panicked. Terrified of returning to the ruling council empty-handed, he physically pushed Vane aside and slammed his fist onto the manual override console. Theron ordered the immediate, uncoordinated deployment of the entire planetary invasion force. 300 million shock troops, packed tightly into heavily armored drop pods, were fired blindly toward the surface to secure a foothold. It rained Vailari steel. But Earth's atmosphere was waiting. As the pods hit the stratosphere, every sensor, every telemetry feed, and every communication relay across the Armada went completely dark. The humans had seeded their own upper atmosphere with hyperdense, electromagnetically charged metallic microparticulates. It was a planetary-scale smokescreen of abrasive chaff. The advanced Vailari targeting matrices, designed to read clean energy signatures and delicate quantum fluctuations, were instantly blinded by the physical dust. The fleet was suddenly deaf, dumb, and blind. The vanguard of the drop pods punched through the smog layer, and visual feeds finally blinked back online for the descending troops. Vane, watching the fragmented streams from the Dreadnought's bridge, saw the terrifying truth. The glittering, fragile megacities they had expected to easily conquer were nowhere to be found. The real human settlements were brutalist nightmares of sheer survival. They were massive, heavily fortified bunkers built directly into the tectonic plates. They were subterranean fortresses shielded by miles of solid bedrock, and sprawling military complexes seamlessly integrated into towering, impassable mountain ranges. Humanity had not built a civilization of glass and vanity. They had weaponized their own geology. Then, the mountains opened up, hidden beneath the Earth's crust. Colossal electromagnetic railguns tracked the descending Vailari pods. The humans did not fire lasers. They fired dense, hypervelocity slugs of depleted uranium and tungsten. The logic was brutally simple and deeply humiliating. The Vailari deflector shields were designed to disperse heat and energy, not to stop sheer kinetic mass traveling at Mach 20. The human railgun rounds simply ignored the advanced energy barriers. They punched clean through the dark matter hulls of the descending troop transports as if they were made of wet parchment. The sky filled with the silent, blooming deaths of tens of thousands of drop pods. Their occupants instantly liquefied by the massive shift in atmospheric pressure and kinetic force. The vaunted Vailari military machine was being shredded by the universe's most primitive concept of warfare, throwing something heavy with terrifying speed. It was a slaughter that defied all imperial logic. Highly trained soldiers bred for conquest were erased from existence before they even touched the dirt. Suddenly, a violent shudder tore through the Sun Eater. Alarms shrieked across the bridge. A tungsten round the size of a scout ship had clipped the Dreadnought's port bow. The impact sheared through 3 layers of reinforced armor, collapsing bulkheads and venting entire decks into the cold vacuum of space. Vane scrambled to his feet, pulling up the internal damage reports on a flickering auxiliary screen. His blood turned to ice. The kinetic strike had directly compromised the erudite sector. Vane opened a secure channel, his voice cracking as he ordered Lyra to evacuate to the central command spine immediately. Static hissed back at him. The automated safety protocols of her severely damaged section had already engaged to prevent further decompression. On his main tactical display, Vane watched helplessly as her emergency escape pod was forcibly jettisoned from the dying Dreadnought. He tracked its trajectory. It was spiraling out of control, trailing thick black smoke, heading straight toward a massive, uncharted expanse of dense forest on the northern continent below. The commander of 1,000,000 ships made a choice that would permanently brand him a traitor to the Empire. He abandoned his post, ignoring Commissar Theron's demands for him to stand his ground and face a court-martial. Vane drew his sidearm, rallied a small detachment of his elite personal guard, and bolted for the hangar bay. They commandeered an armored drop shuttle, detached violently from the bleeding flagship, and dived directly into the churning maelstrom of the atmosphere. The descent was a nightmare. They navigated a gauntlet of incoming ballistic fire and the flaming wreckage of their own destroyed armada. The shuttle's hull groaned, heat shielding peeling away like dead skin. They crashed hard into the dense, overgrown ruins of what used to be a human coastal city, now entirely reclaimed by twisted, aggressive vegetation. The ramp of the shuttle lowered with a heavy mechanical groan. The air outside was thick, stiflingly humid, and smelled sharply of ozone, crushed foliage, and ash. Vane stepped onto the soil of Earth, his plasma rifle raised, his elite guard fanning out in a defensive perimeter. They were supposed to be the apex predators of the galaxy, the conquerors of 1,000 worlds. But as Vane stared into the impenetrable shadows of the towering, mutated trees, listening to the unsettling rustle of movement just beyond their line of sight, a chilling realization settled over him. They had dropped straight into a cage, and the locals were already closing in. A death trap is rarely forged from steel and concrete. The most efficient executioners are born directly from the dirt itself. Vane and his remaining 6 elite guards moved through the choking humidity of the overgrown ruins. The architecture of the old human coastal city was barely visible under a suffocating blanket of engineered vegetation. This was no natural planetary reclamation. The humans had rewritten the genetic code of their own flora to serve as an active, merciless perimeter defense. As the Vailari soldiers advanced, the surrounding foliage reacted violently to their foreign thermal signatures and alien respiration. Broad, serrated leaves whipped out like tripwires, strong enough to dent armor plating. Phosphorescent spore pods burst under their heavy boots, clogging the intake valves of their environmental suits with a corrosive, acidic slime that began eating through their primary filters within seconds. Vane watched in horror as his vanguard soldier brushed against a hanging vine, only to be instantly paralyzed as thousands of microscopic neurotoxic barbs pierced the flexible mesh of his neck seal. The soldier collapsed, silently convulsing as the root system of the plant rapidly entangled his limbs, literally dragging him screaming into the dark underbrush. Before Vane could issue an order to burn the perimeter with sweeping plasma fire, the true hunters arrived. The skirmish was a masterclass in asymmetrical slaughter. The humans did not march in formation or announce their presence with battle cries. They emerged like ghosts from the twisted roots and shattered concrete. Vane fired his plasma rifle, sending a blinding arc of superheated energy toward a shifting shadow. The shot connected squarely with a human soldier's chest, but instead of vaporizing the target, the human's armor rippled. The adaptive plating instantly shifted its thermal density. Absorbing and harmlessly dissipating, the plasma burst into a localized cloud of heavy steam. The Vailari were trained for honorable line formation engagements against conventional logical armies. The humans fought like cornered predators who had abandoned the concept of military honor centuries ago. They utilized magnetic grapple lines to swing through the thick canopy, dropping silently behind Vane's men to deliver brutal, close-quarters executions with monomolecular blades that bypassed the Vailari energy shields entirely. They hurled gravity inversion grenades that ripped the heavy Vailari soldiers violently into the air, exposing their unarmored joints to a devastating crossfire of hypervelocity flechette rounds. In less than 3 minutes, Vane's elite guard, the finest, most decorated warriors of the Ascendant caste, were reduced to bleeding, broken corpses scattered across the alien soil. Vane ducked behind the rusted, moss-covered husk of a ground transport, his breathing ragged, his suit's power core flashing a critical warning. He realized with a sickening twist in his gut that the human strike team could have killed him a dozen times over during the ambush. They were deliberately missing his vital organs, systematically shooting the weapons out of his guard's hands, and methodically herding him deeper into the ruins toward a highly specific, predetermined coordinate. He was not a combatant to them. He was livestock being driven into a pen, though he could not fathom what intelligence they hoped to extract from a dying commander. A deafening structural crack echoed from the heavens, drawing his single eye upward through a break in the thick, mutated canopy. The sky above Earth was no longer a battlefield. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The Vailari Armada, still locked in orbital paralysis as their weapon systems forcefully rebooted, was being methodically devoured. Vane zoomed his optical implant to maximum magnification and finally understood the grim reality of the human defense strategy. The vast fields of space debris and shattered satellites orbiting the planet had not been passive junk left over from a dead civilization. They were millions of sleeper drones, heavily armored and completely dormant until the Vailari fleet drifted right into their midst. Now awakened, the mechanical parasites swarmed the massive dreadnoughts. They did not fire energy weapons or launch missiles. They simply latched onto the impenetrable dark matter hulls. Deploying heavy-duty mining lasers, kinetic jackhammers, and molecular acid drills, Vane watched his glorious fleet being dismantled piece by piece from the outside in. The drones were carving the capital ships apart like ocean scavengers stripping a bloated whale carcass, venting atmosphere, crew, and machinery into the freezing void. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the defeat broke his combat focus for a fraction of a second. It was all the humans needed. A heavy weighted bolus wrapped around Vane's ankles, violently snapping his legs together and driving him face first into the mud. Before he could roll over and raise his sidearm, a heavy boot stamped down on his wrist, shattering the bone and forcing him to drop his weapon. Vane was roughly shoved onto his back, gasping for air as the acidic mud seeped into the cracked visor of his helmet. He was completely surrounded. Half a dozen human soldiers stood over him, their adaptive camouflage rippling back to a matte, tactical black. Red laser sights danced across his chest plate, perfectly tracking his erratic breathing. Vane closed his eye, bracing for the kinetic round that would punch through his skull and end his absolute failure. He expected a swift, unceremonious execution. Instead, the pressure on his chest eased. A figure stepped forward from the tight circle of soldiers and slowly disengaged their helmet seals. The helmet hissed and pulled away, revealing the face of a human male. The man was older, his face etched with deep, ragged scars and the hard lines of a lifetime spent in sheer survival. His eyes were a cold, piercing gray. He did not look at Vane with the fiery hatred of a conquered victim or the zealous rage of a holy warrior. He looked at the fallen fleet commander with the detached, highly analytical curiosity of a scientist examining a particularly persistent, somewhat annoying insect. The human commander crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face inches from Vane's shattered visor. When he finally spoke, it was not in the guttural, primitive barking Vane had been told to expect from this species. The human spoke in absolutely flawless upper dialect Vailari, a highly complex aristocratic tongue that took imperial scholars decades to master. Calmly asking Vane a question that suggested a terrifying, intimate knowledge of the Empire's deepest political secrets. The absolute worst thing you can do to a creature that believes it is a god is to show it just how remarkably ordinary it truly is. Vane awoke to the dull, throbbing ache of a fractured skull and the harsh, unfiltered glare of a single incandescent bulb swinging from a low ceiling. He expected to find himself in a high-tech containment field, restrained by anti-gravity tethers in a pristine, white-walled interrogation chamber. Instead, he was sitting on a hard metal cot bolted to a poured concrete floor. The walls were uneven, stained with old watermarks and rust. Thick, exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, venting steam and carrying the muffled, rhythmic thud of heavy machinery. The air smelled of industrial bleach, damp earth, and something sharply bitter that stung his nostrils. It was a gritty, utterly utilitarian cage devoid of elegance. To a Vailari aristocrat accustomed to the seamless, voice-activated perfection of his empire, this crude, physical room was more insulting than an execution. The heavy iron door swung open with a harsh scrape of metal against concrete. The human commander who had captured him stepped inside, dragging a scuffed folding chair behind him. He wore standard military fatigues, stripped of any shining medals or ceremonial capes. He carried 2 steaming ceramic mugs. He sat down backward on the chair, resting his arms over the backrest, and offered one of the mugs to Vane. Vane did not move. He stared at the dark, boiling liquid. He demanded to know if it was a chemical solvent designed to loosen his tongue. The human let out a short, dry laugh, took a slow sip from his own mug, and sighed. He introduced himself as Major Elias Thorne. He explained that the liquid was a mild stimulant called coffee, and that it was primarily consumed to keep humanity functioning through a state of permanent, low-level exhaustion. When Vane still refused to take the mug, Thorne placed it on the floor between them. Thorne leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto Vane. He told the fleet commander that he looked like a deer in headlights. Vane stiffened, his mind racing through the tactical databanks implanted in his cerebral cortex. He stated confidently that he did not know what a deer was, but he assumed it was a terrifying, plasma-resistant apex predator from Earth's deepest jungles. Thorne rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture of profound weariness. He explained that a deer was a skittish prey animal with a nasty habit of freezing completely still right before a heavy transport vehicle crushed it to death. He then noted that Vane and his million-ship armada had just pulled the exact same maneuver. The insult flared Vane's imperial pride. He spat that humanity had simply gotten lucky with a cowardly ambush, hiding in the dirt and throwing rocks rather than fighting a civilized war. He promised Thorne that when the High Council realized the armada was delayed, they would send a specialized cleansing fleet to crack the planet's core. Thorne did not look frightened. He simply looked amused. He offered Vane a compressed ration bar wrapped in crinkling foil, asking if the commander wanted a bite, adding casually that the Vailari had bitten off way more than they could chew. Vane stared at the foil wrapper in absolute bewilderment. He stated firmly that he would rather starve than consume weaponized human explosives. Thorne paused, the ration bar halfway to his mouth. He looked at Vane, then at the bar, and burst into genuine, unrestrained laughter. He realized the alien commander was taking every human idiom completely literally. Thorne shook his head, remarking that sarcasm was entirely lost on a species that marched in perfect geometric formations. The brief moment of levity dissolved as Thorne leaned in, his demeanor shifting from casual to deadly serious. He asked Vane a simple question. Why send 1,000,000 ships? Vane recited the imperial doctrine. He spoke of manifest destiny, the requirement of the ascendant caste to bring order to chaotic systems, and the right to harvest resources from lesser beings. He puffed out his chest, asserting that the Vailari had not lost a military engagement in 3,000 years. Thorne countered immediately, dismantling the grand Vailari mythos with surgical precision. He told Vane that a species that has not lost a fight in 3 millennia has completely forgotten how to survive one. Thorne painted a brutal picture of humanity's history. He explained that humans had nearly wiped themselves out multiple times through atomic fire, engineered plagues, and climate collapse. They had poisoned their own air, shattered their own continents, and spent centuries fighting brutal, desperate wars over the remaining scraps of habitable land. Humanity did not evolve through easy conquests. They evolved by crawling out of their own radioactive ashes. Thorne pointed a finger at Vane's chest. He explained that the Vailari Empire was a stagnant monolith. They relied on overwhelming numbers and ancient, repurposed technology. Their deflector shields were marvels of engineering, but their logic algorithms had not been updated in centuries because they had never faced an enemy capable of challenging them. The Vailari caste system, Thorne argued, was their greatest weakness. The thinkers stayed in their laboratories, the politicians sat on their thrones, and the soldiers marched forward blindly. They never questioned orders, and they never improvised. When the Vailari drop pods lost their sensor arrays in the atmospheric chaff, the shock troops panicked because their screens went dark. When human communications go dark, Thorne explained, every single soldier simply adapts and becomes an autonomous, highly lethal weapon. Vane absorbed the brutal critique. The logic was deeply offensive, yet entirely sound. The humans had not just beaten them with kinetic weapons and engineered traps. They had beaten them with aggressive, relentless adaptability. Vane asked how they knew the fleet was coming. Thorne tapped the side of his head. He explained that light and gravity take time to travel across the cosmos. Decades ago, human deep space observatories detected massive, unnatural gravitational lensing near the Vailari home system. They watched the Armada assemble. They mapped the trajectory. They had 30 years to dig deep into the bedrock, weaponize their ecosystem, and turn their orbital junkyards into a sleeper swarm of mechanical locusts. The Vailari were so arrogant, so blinded by their own divine right to rule, that it never once occurred to them that their primitive prey might be watching the skies right back. Silence hung heavy in the damp concrete cell. The absolute magnitude of the Empire's failure crushed Vane's spirit. He looked down at his shackled hands, the reality of his total defeat washing away the last remnants of his arrogance. He quietly asked Thorne what he intended to do with a broken commander. Thorne stood up and grabbed his coffee mug. He told Vane that keeping a high-ranking prisoner of war was a logistical nightmare he had no interest in managing. However, he had a compelling reason to keep Vane breathing, and he wanted to show him exactly what that was. Thorne ordered the heavily armed guards standing outside the door to escort the prisoner. They marched Vane down a labyrinth of harsh, dimly lit subterranean corridors. The facility was sprawling, humming with the frantic energy of a hive. They passed heavily armored mechanics welding thick metal plates onto damaged transports, and soot-stained soldiers reloading massive kinetic magazines. The sheer, chaotic industrial scale of human survival was overwhelming. Eventually, the harsh noise gave way to the quiet, sterile hum of a medical wing. Thorne led Vane into an observation gallery overlooking a secure trauma suite. A dozen human medical personnel were rushing around a central operating table. They were speaking in rapid, urgent tones, their white coats stained with vibrant, glowing blue fluid. Vailari blood. Vane pressed his hands against the thick observation glass, his solitary eye widening in shock. Lying on the table, surrounded by a mess of synthetic tubes and pumping mechanical ventilators, was Lyra. Her elegant erudite robes had been cut away, replaced by standard-issue surgical drapes. Her face was ashen, her breathing painfully shallow and assisted by a machine. The right side of her body was heavily bandaged, masking the massive trauma she had sustained when her escape pod slammed into the forest canopy. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly out of place in the grim human bunker. A heavy knot formed in Vane's throat. He had assumed she burned in the atmosphere or was torn apart by the weaponized jungle. Seeing her alive brought a sudden, violent surge of hope, immediately followed by a crushing wave of despair as a human surgeon aggressively shocked her chest to stabilize a failing heartbeat. Thorne stepped up beside Vane, looking down at the frantic medical scene. He kept his voice low, stripped of all its previous sarcasm. He explained that his scouts had pulled her from the wreckage just before the perimeter vines dragged her under. She was fighting hard, but the human medical technology was fundamentally incompatible with Vailari physiology. They could stabilize her temporarily, but her organs were failing. Vane turned to Thorne, his voice trembling for the first time since the Armada launched. He begged the human commander to save her, offering all his remaining tactical knowledge, his command codes, anything they wanted. Thorne met Vane's desperate gaze with a look of cold, calculating pragmatism. "We can keep her comfortable, Commander," Thorne whispered, the ambient light of the medical bay reflecting off his cold gray eyes. "But if you want her to have any real chance of ever seeing the stars again, you and I are going to have to commit the greatest act of treason your empire has ever seen." Treason is merely a matter of perspective. To a desperate man standing in the ashes of his own life, it is simply the only remaining logic. Thorne did not wait for an answer. He turned his back on the observation window and gestured for Vane to follow him deeper into the human bunker. Vane cast one last agonizing look at Lyra on the operating table before falling into step beside the human commander. They walked in heavy silence until they reached a set of reinforced blast doors that parted to reveal the nerve center of the human resistance. It was a cavernous room bathed in the cool blue light of a massive central hollow table. Dozens of analysts and tacticians moved with quiet, focused urgency. There was no shouting, no panicked running, none of the chaotic posturing that defined a Vailari command deck during a crisis. Thorn stepped up to the hollow table and keyed a sequence. The projection above them shifted, displaying a real-time, high-definition orbital feed of the Earth. Vane stopped breathing. The sky was falling. The proud Vailari Grand Armada, the million-ship terror of the cosmos, was dying. But they were not being destroyed by overwhelming firepower. They were simply shutting down. Across the holographic display, the massive energy signatures of the dreadnoughts and cruisers flared violently from a healthy blue to a sickly, corrupted yellow, and then went entirely dark. Without their primary thrusters and dark matter containment fields holding them in a stable orbit, the immense gravitational pull of the planet took hold. Thorn pointed to the projection, his voice utterly devoid of triumph, carrying only the grim weight of survival. He explained that humanity knew they could never win a war of attrition against 1,000,000 capital ships, so they did not fight the armor, they fought the nervous system. While the Vailari fleet was blinded by the atmospheric chaff and distracted by the kinetic surface strikes, human stealth probes had detonated in the upper exosphere. They did not release explosives. They released a highly concentrated, localized techno-organic virus. It was a digital plague engineered to hunt Vailari software. The virus was designed to infiltrate the communication arrays and rapidly rewrite the fundamental logic cores of the ships. It fed on their synchronization protocols, turning the highly networked efficiency of the Armada into a fatal weakness. The virus instructed the dark matter reactors to initiate an emergency shutdown and physically locked the high command out of their own mainframes. Vane watched in absolute horror as the pride of his empire turned into millions of tons of dead, falling iron. The ships entered the atmosphere without their deflector shields. The friction of re-entry ignited their colossal hulls. To anyone standing on the surface of the Earth, the sky would look like a biblical meteor shower, 1,000,000 streaks of searing white fire raining down upon the oceans and the irradiated wastelands. It was a visual spectacle of unparalleled destruction, the total erasure of a galactic superpower in a matter of minutes. Thorn tapped another console, feeding the intercepted Vailari communication frequencies into the room's primary audio channel. Vane expected to hear the valiant last orders of his captains, the stoic acceptance of warriors dying for the glory of the ascendant caste. Instead, he heard a pathetic, chaotic slaughter. The audio feeds were filled with the panicked, high-pitched screaming of the political officers. Commissar Theron's voice echoed through the command center, completely stripped of its arrogant authority. Theron was not organizing a final stand. He was hysterically screaming at his own engineering staff, accusing them of sabotage and cowardice. The sound of Vailari plasma sidearms discharging at close range filtered through the static. The politicians were executing their own crews in a blind, terrified rage, desperately fighting over the few functional, unnetworked escape pods while abandoning millions of soldiers to burn alive in the plunging ships. Thorn looked at Vane, his gray eyes reflecting the grim reality of the audio feed. He stated quietly that a society built entirely on a foundation of absolute fear and rigid obedience will always devour itself the moment the script is burned. The Vailari leaders were so conditioned to blame others for failure that they spent their final moments murdering their own people instead of trying to save them. The critique was a physical blow to Vane. His entire worldview, his lifelong dedication to the honor of the Empire, shattered into dust right there in the human command center. A sharp, flashing red light on Thorne's personal communication device broke the heavy silence. He answered it, listening for only a few seconds before his expression hardened. He looked at Vane. They ran. Vane ignored the agonizing pain in his shattered wrist, his heavy boots pounding against the concrete floor as he followed Thorne back through the labyrinth of corridors. They burst through the doors of the medical wing just as the frantic activity around the central operating table suddenly ceased. The human doctors and nurses stepped back, pulling off their blood-stained gloves, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Vane pushed past a surgeon and fell to his knees beside the table. Lyra's chest was still. The mechanical ventilators had been turned off. The damage from the atmospheric crash was simply too catastrophic. Her internal organs completely failing under the strain of alien medical intervention. Vane reached out with his good hand, his trembling fingers gently brushing against her pale cheek. Her eyes fluttered open one last time. The sharp, cynical spark that had defined the brilliant erudite scholar was fading, replaced by a profound, quiet peace. She looked at Vane, the fallen commander of a dead fleet. She did not speak of the Empire, or the war, or the tragedy of their situation. She simply offered a weak, fleeting smile. She whispered that the sky had been entirely too quiet. Then, the tension left her body, and she was gone. Vane did not scream. He did not weep. He sat in the blinding white light of the alien medical bay, staring at the woman he loved, and felt his soul completely hollow out. The furious, proud fleet commander died in that room alongside her. The man who slowly rose to his feet a few minutes later was completely empty, a vessel entirely stripped of its loyalty, its history, and its purpose. The Empire had taken everything from him, forced him into a war of pure greed, and rewarded him with a universe composed only of ash. Thorne stood quietly in the doorway, respectfully giving the alien commander the time he needed. When Vane finally turned around, his solitary eye was as cold and dead as the void of space. He looked at the human major and asked for a weapon, stating that he was ready to join his fleet in the dirt. Thorne shook his head. He stepped into the room, his hands resting on his tactical belt. He told Vane that humanity had not engineered a planetary defense just to execute prisoners of war in their basements. They fought to live, not to inflict unnecessary suffering. The human commander stepped closer, entirely unbothered by the towering alien hovering over him. He offered Vane a proposition that was far more terrifying than a simple execution. Thorne explained that out of 1,000,000 ships, his tactical network had intentionally spared exactly one, high in orbit, safely tethered beyond the reach of the atmospheric virus, sat a single heavily damaged but functional dreadnought. It was Vane's flagship, the Sun Eater. Human engineering teams were currently boarding it, bypassing its infected logic cores with crude, manual human analog systems. They were patching the hull with welded steel plates and overriding the navigation protocols. Vane stared at him, unable to comprehend the logic. He asked Thorne why they would spend resources repairing an enemy warship. Thorne's expression turned into a mask of pure, calculating stone. He told Vane that he was going to take the helm of that patched-together monstrosity. He was going to break the gravity well of Earth, engage the jump drive, and fly back to the Vylari homeworld. Vane was going to go home entirely alone. A dead man cannot be punished, which is precisely why the most terrifying sentences require the condemned to keep breathing. Vane stood in the stark light of the human medical bay, the cold reality of Thorne's proposition settling over him like a suffocating shroud. He was to return to Valar Prime. He was to look the Ascendant caste in the eye and tell them that their absolute, divine authority had been shattered by a species that still used internal combustion engines and drank boiled leaf water to stay awake. It was a fate infinitely worse than bleeding out in the alien mud. He looked at Thorn, his voice devoid of any remaining Imperial pride. He stated that the Sun Eater was a Class 9 dreadnought. It required a synchronized crew of 4,000 specialists just to manage the dark matter containment fields, and an entire cast of navigators to plot a slipspace fold. Flying it solo was not a matter of courage. It was a mathematical impossibility. Thorn did not blink. He explained that human engineers had spent the last 12 hours gutting the infected Vylari neurolink systems. They had surgically removed the corrupted logic cores and bypassed the elegant, voice-activated command consoles with crude, physical analog systems. They had essentially turned a god machine into a deeply ugly, highly temperamental tractor. It would be incredibly difficult to fly, and it would hurt, but it would get him home. The human commander then reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a heavy, rectangular storage drive constructed of solid, brushed steel. It looked archaic, lacking the elegant crystalline structure of Vylari data spools. Thorn pressed the cold metal into Vane's uninjured hand. Thorn instructed Vane to plug the drive directly into the Sun Eater's primary broadcast array the absolute second he dropped out of slipspace above the Vylari homeworld. He explicitly warned the alien commander not to open the file himself. It was a tailored message, a highly specific diplomatic package meant exclusively for the eyes of the High Council. Vane stared at the crude metal block. He asked Thorn what the humans were demanding. He asked if they wanted reparations, territorial concessions, or a formal surrender. A grim, humorless smile crossed Thorn's scarred face. He told Vane that humanity had absolutely zero interest in Vylari territory, their currency, or their politics. The message contained a guarantee. It was the exact quantifiable cost of their arrogance, and a promise of what would happen if a single Vylari ship ever crossed into the Sol system again. 2 hours later, Vane was strapped into the rear seat of a heavily armored human atmospheric shuttle. The pilot, a young human female chewing a piece of synthetic resin, did not utter a single word to her alien passenger. The shuttle violently punched through the dense engineered cloud cover of Earth, shaking violently as it navigated the turbulent upper atmosphere. As they broke the exosphere, the true horrifying scale of the slaughter was laid bare before Vane's single eye. Low Earth orbit had been transformed into a planetary graveyard. 1,000,000 majestic warships, the undisputed pride of the Vylari Empire, were reduced to an expanding ring of jagged metal, frozen coolant, and shattered crystal. The sun crested over the curvature of the Earth, illuminating the slaughter in a harsh, unforgiving light. Vane saw the bisected hull of the Vanguard, its massive plasma cannons sheared completely off. He saw the gutted remains of the Oblivion, wrapped in a swarm of dormant human sleeper drones like metallic maggots on a corpse. Thousands of frozen Vylari bodies floated silently in the void, their faces contorted in the final agonizing realization of their own mortality. The human shuttle carefully threaded the needle through the dense debris field, finally approaching the Sun Eater. The dreadnought was a grotesque mockery of its former glory. Its sleek, impenetrable dark matter hull was riddled with massive gaping craters, wherever the human kinetic rounds had punched through. Human engineering teams had simply welded massive, ugly slabs of salvaged steel over the wounds. Thick, crude welding seams crisscrossed the elegant architecture like horrific scars. The ship was no longer a symbol of imperial perfection. It was a stitched-together corpse forced back into animation. The shuttle docked heavily with the lower airlock. Vane stepped through the pressure seal, entirely alone. The interior of his flagship was freezing. The pristine, glowing white corridors of the Ascendant caste were dark, illuminated only by the harsh, pulsing amber glow of human-installed emergency floodlights. Thick bundles of black rubber cables snaked along the floors and walls. violently bypassing the sophisticated power conduits. The air was stale, carrying the metallic tang of dried blood and the sharp scent of ozone. Vane walked the long, lonely path to the command bridge. Along the way, he passed the heavily barricaded doors of the political wing. The walls were scorched by close-range plasma fire. He saw the discarded, blood-stained ceremonial sashes of Commissar Theron's entourage. Thorne had been entirely correct. In the face of absolute systemic failure, the rigid Vailari hierarchy had instantly collapsed into a violent, cannibalistic panic. He reached the bridge. The massive panoramic viewport was deeply spiderwebbed with impact fractures. The elegant, sweeping command consoles had been physically ripped from the deck. In their place sat a brutalist iron rig welded directly to the floor. It featured heavy hydraulic levers, thick toggle switches, and an array of primitive glass monitors glowing with aggressive green human text. Vane lowered himself into the central command chair. It was designed for a king surrounded by thousands of loyal subjects. Now, it held a broken prisoner of war. He reached out with his uninjured hand and grasped the heavy iron throttle the humans had wired to the primary sublight engines. He pushed it forward. The Sun Eater emitted a deafening, structural groan. The deck vibrated violently as the bypass thrusters flared to life. Vane piloted the wounded Leviathan forward. He was forced to physically wrestle with the heavy hydraulic levers, using his own muscular strength to correct the ship's erratic yaw and pitch. He steered the massive dreadnought slowly and carefully through the drifting wreckage of his own fleet. The silence on the bridge was absolute, a crushing heavy weight that amplified the ghosts of the millions who had died under his command. He flew past the frozen face of a young shock trooper drifting just outside the cracked viewport. A boy who had likely believed Vane was an infallible tactical genius, breaking clear of the orbital debris field. Vane aligned the crude human navigation reticle with the distant, invisible coordinates of the Vailari homeworld. He engaged the modified dark matter fold drive. The archaic human relays spat showers of sparks. The patched hull groaned as the ship violently tore a hole in the fabric of space. The stars outside the cracked viewport blurred into blinding streaks of light. And then the Sun Eater vanished into the void. Vane sat in the freezing, amber-lit silence of slipspace. The adrenaline of the escape finally faded, replaced by a profound, agonizing emptiness. He looked down at the heavy steel data drive resting on the console beside him. He was a ghost carrying a message of absolute defeat back to a kingdom of deaf men. He wondered if the High Lords would even have the capacity to comprehend the gravity of the executioner's blade that now hovered directly over their necks, or if their legendary arrogance would finally secure their absolute extinction. Arrogance is a fortress built entirely on sand. It only takes a single drop of undeniable truth to wash it away. The harsh, sterile light of the interrogation chamber seemed to buzz with a sudden, suffocating intensity. High Lord Kalen stood perfectly still, his golden robes hanging heavily on his shoulders as Vane's harrowing tale concluded. For a long, agonizing moment, there was absolute silence. Then, Kalen threw his head back and laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound, entirely devoid of genuine amusement. It was the desperate laughter of a man violently rejecting reality. Kalen began to pace rapidly, his polished boots clicking against the polished floor. He accused Vane of losing his mind to the trauma of a navigational anomaly. He spun a wild, immediate conspiracy theory, claiming Vane had sold the Grand Armada to a coalition of deep space pirates, or that a rogue cosmic event had swallowed the fleet, and Vane was simply too cowardly to admit his failure. The High Lord aggressively pointed a manicured finger at the prisoner, stating unequivocally that a species reliant on crude kinetic ballistics and internal combustion engines could not possibly outmaneuver the supreme intellect of the ascendant caste. The entire narrative of weaponized jungles, digital plagues, and sleeper swarms was a pathetic fiction designed to mask Vane's own legendary incompetence. Vane did not argue. He did not raise his voice to defend his honor, because he no longer had any honor to defend. He simply sat in the uncomfortable chair, his single eye watching Kalen with a profound, terrifying pity. Kalen ordered the guards to prepare Vane for a public execution, declaring that the Empire would not be humiliated by the mad ramblings of a broken traitor. Vane slowly raised his uninjured hand and rested it on the smooth, crystalline surface of the interrogation table. He looked at the High Lord and stated that the execution would have to wait. Because the humans had one final message they insisted on delivering personally. Before the guards could step forward to restrain him, Vane's fingers danced across the console. In the absolute panic of the Sun Eater crashing into the dunes, the ruling council had made a fatal bureaucratic error. They had stripped Vane of his armor and his rank, but they had forgotten to revoke his alpha-level command biometric access in the central planetary network. Vane bypassed the room's internal security firewall in less than 3 seconds. He reached out to the primary broadcast array of his ruined flagship, sitting out there in the desert, and triggered the human data packet he had uploaded the exact millisecond he dropped out of slipspace. The harsh overhead lights of the interrogation chamber instantly died. The room plunged into total darkness, save for the sudden, blinding flare of the central holotable. Kalen stumbled back, demanding the guards shoot the console. But the guards were entirely paralyzed by the image materializing in the center of the room. It was not a pre-recorded video of a human diplomat demanding terms of surrender. It was a live, highly encrypted telemetry feed directly from the heart of the Vailari home system. The projection displayed the Empire's twin suns, massive spheres of churning, golden plasma that had bathed their world in light for billions of years. But hovering just above the coronal loops of the stars, perfectly holding their position against the immense gravitational pull, were 3 massive alien structures. They were brutalist, black iron platforms, devoid of any elegant design or aesthetic consideration. They looked like floating industrial slaughterhouses. The human stealth platforms had bypassed the legendary Vailari border defenses without triggering a single alarm. They had been sitting there in the blistering heat of the twin stars, quietly waiting for Vane to return and activate their broadcast transponders. As Kalen stared in open-mouthed horror, the human feed overlaid a crude, aggressive green schematic onto the holographic projection. It detailed the payload housed within those black iron monoliths. They were not conventional explosives. They were localized dark matter implosion warheads, tethered directly to the unstable magnetic fields of the twin suns. The High Lord's face drained of all color. His legs gave out, and he collapsed heavily into a chair. The golden robe suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He did not need an erudite scholar to explain the physics to him. If those platforms detonated, they would violently compress the cores of the twin stars, instantly triggering a dual, artificial supernova. The resulting blast wave would incinerate Valar Prime and every surrounding colony within 30 seconds. The heart of the Empire would be reduced to a cloud of radioactive ash before the ruling council even had time to scream. The absolute, undisputed power of the Vailari Empire shattered right there in the dark. The realization hit Kalen with the physical force of a kinetic strike. They were not gods. They were hostages. Vane stood up. He no longer looked like a prisoner in a drab tunic. He carried the heavy, unyielding posture of the only adult in a room entirely filled with arrogant children. He looked down at the trembling High Lord. He explained that humanity did not want their resources, their territory, or their subjugation. The humans had survived their own darkest hours by learning the fundamental value of existence, a moral lesson the Vailari had ignored in their endless pursuit of conquest. The humans possessed the power to extinguish their entire civilization with a single keystroke, yet they chose restraint. Vane delivered the final terms of humanity's absolute mercy. He told Kalen that they were allowed to keep their world. They were allowed to live, to breathe, and to look up at their twin suns. But if a single Vylari warship, a single automated probe, or even a single aggressive transmission ever crossed into the Sol system again, the humans would not send a warning. They would simply turn the Vylari sky into a funeral pyre. The fleet commander looked directly into the security camera blinking in the corner of the room. Knowing the entire ruling council was watching in terrified silence, Vane stated that he had not returned as a conquering hero, nor as a cowardly traitor. He had returned as a beggar, entirely reliant on the mercy of a species they had sought to destroy, pleading with his own masters to simply stay in their lane and survive. He reached down, keyed a final command into the holotable, and the room was plunged back into the harsh, sterile light of the present. The projection vanished, leaving only the crushing weight of their new reality. I want to thank you for taking this incredible journey with me into the dark, uncharted territories of human survival and alien hubris. Writing these stories for you is a phenomenal experience, and I deeply appreciate every single one of you who tuned in to listen to this grand sci-fi epic. If this story grabbed you, if you felt the tension of the drop pods and the sheer scale of the human retaliation, please make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next adventure. Share this video with anyone who loves a gritty, tactical science fiction narrative where humanity refuses to go quietly into the night. Before you go, I need you to absolutely smash that hype button so the algorithm pushes this story out to more viewers who crave exactly this kind of intense, strategic storytelling. And jump down into the comments section right now and leave the word survival so I know you made it all the way to the end of the Sun Eater's tragic voyage.